Madge Oberholtzer was the victim of one of Indiana's most shocking crimes, the brutal rape by D.C. Stevenson, Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, in March 1925. This horrific act ultimately led to her death following a suicide attempt. Madge, who lived in the Irvington neighborhood of Indianapolis, provided crucial deathbed testimony that contributed to Stevenson's conviction for second-degree murder. This case marked a significant turning point in the decline of the Klan's influence in Indiana during the 1920s. Born to German-American parents, Madge grew up in Indianapolis, where her father worked as a postal clerk and her family belonged to the Irvington Methodist Church. Madge studied English, mathematics, zoology, and logic at Butler College in Irvington, but she dropped out at the end of her junior year without saying why. Throughout her life, she lived with her parents in Irvington. By the time she met Stevenson, Madge was the manager of the Indiana Young People's Reading Circle, a special section of the Indiana Department of Public Instruction. However, she heard rumors that her job and the Reading Circle program were about to be eliminated due to budget cuts. Stevenson was born in 1891 in Houston, Texas, the son of a sharecropper, Andrew Monroe Stevenson. The family moved to Maysville, Oklahoma, where he attended school in a Methodist church. He was an avid reader, especially interested in politics and history, and graduated from the 8th grade at age 16. That was the end of his formal education. He got a job with a socialist newspaper and studied the party's leaders, particularly Oscar Ameringer, who would go on to advocate for African-American enfranchisement and help elect an anti-Klan governor. Stevenson admired Ameringer's style, the way he sold his politics as if he were a vaudeville pitchman, and he would later implement the socialist techniques at rallies for the Klan. In 1915, the blonde, blue-eyed Stevenson courted a local girl named Nettie Hamilton, placing her picture in the newspaper under the headline, "The Most Beautiful Girl in Oklahoma." They married and moved to Madill, where he worked at the local newspaper. But Stevenson, in what would become a pattern, got into a fight with his publisher after a bout of drinking and lost his job. He abandoned his pregnant wife and drifted to Cushing. In 1917, Nettie tracked him down and filed for a divorce, after which Stevenson volunteered for the army. Instead of fighting bravely on the battlefields of Europe, as he liked to boast, he was sent to Boone, Iowa, to work as a recruiter. After the war, he took a job as a traveling salesman, and in Akron, Ohio, met his next wife, Violet Carroll. The couple moved to Evansville, Indiana, where Stevenson worked as a stock salesman for the Citizens Coal Company, and where a newly revitalized Ku Klux Klan was taking root. Despite his intensely private nature, "It's no one's business where I was born or who my folks were," he once snapped. Stevenson made friends easily, developing a gregarious, slap-shoulder bonhomie, careful to never patronize or condescend. Despite his limited education, his speech was fluent and polished. When a local Klan organizer asked him to get involved, Stevenson initially demurred. "They kept after me," he told the New York World, and explained to me then the Klan was not an organization which took Negroes out, cut off their noses, and threw them into the fire. I was told that the Klan was a strictly patriotic organization. They finally convinced me the Klan was a good thing, and I joined. As Stevenson's career took off, his marriage began to flounder. He drank heavily and succumbed to wild rages, once blackening his wife's eye and another time scratching her face and kicking her. After their divorce in 1922, Madge met D.C. Stevenson at Governor Edward L. Jackson's inauguration party at the Athletic Club in Indianapolis on January 12, 1925. In her dying statement, she recounted that Stevenson asked her out several times after the banquet, but she initially declined. Eventually, she agreed to have dinner with him. After that date, he called her multiple times, and she later consented to meet him for dinner at the Washington Hotel. Their relationship grew, with Madge acting as Stevenson's aide during the 1925 session of the Indiana General Assembly, delivering messages for him. She also assisted him in writing a nutrition book titled 100 Years of Health, intending to help sell it to school libraries through her reading circle connections. However, she ended their relationship after attending a party at his mansion, and they did not see each other again until March 15th. On the evening of March 15th, around 10 p.m., Madge returned home after spending time with a friend. Her mother informed her that Stevenson's secretary had called, saying he was leaving for Chicago and wanted her to call. When Madge reached out, Stevenson promised to protect her job with the reading circle if she agreed to see him. She changed into a black velvet dress, and a bodyguard named Mr. Gentry, Earl Gentry, escorted her to Stevenson's mansion. Upon arrival, Stevenson, Gentry, and another bodyguard, referred to as Clenk, took her into the kitchen and forced her to drink whiskey until she became ill. They then took her upstairs, where Stevenson retrieved a revolver and forced her to approach him at gunpoint. Madge stated that they took her to the garage and forced her into Stevenson's car. Before leaving, Stevenson instructed Clenk to inform an associate that he was heading to Chicago for a business meeting. At the railroad station, Stevenson and Gentry forced her onto his private train. Once inside the train compartment, Stevenson violently assaulted her, repeatedly raping her and inflicting bite marks all over her body. Overwhelmed and intoxicated, she eventually lost consciousness. When she regained consciousness, Madge confronted Stevenson, declaring that the law will get their hands on you. He laughed and replied, "I am the law in Indiana," reflecting his political power through the Klan. After dressing her, Gentry and Stevenson checked into the Indiana Hotel in Hammond, forcing Madge to claim she was Stevenson's wife. He made her write a telegram to her mother, stating she had decided to go to Chicago with him. While Stevenson slept, Madge contemplated using his revolver to end her life, but chose instead to take poison, fearing it would bring disgrace to her mother. The next morning, she persuaded Stevenson to call his chauffeur, Ernest Shorty DeFries, to take her to buy a black silk hat. During the outing, she purchased mercuric chloride tablets. Back in her room, still weak from her injuries, she managed to swallow only 3 before vomiting blood throughout the day. Stevenson refused to take her to a hospital unless she agreed to marry him, but in a panic, he ordered Shorty to drive them back to Indianapolis. When asked about her condition, a bodyguard claimed she had been in a car accident. Madge's parents quickly called for a doctor, but it was too late to save her. On March 28th, she provided a signed statement detailing her ordeal. She died on April 14th, 1925, from a staph infection due to the bites and kidney failure from the mercury poisoning. In the first days after the assault, when hope still existed for a full recovery by Madge, Asa Smith approached Stevenson concerning a monetary settlement that would provide some compensation for the Oberholtzers, but spare the family the embarrassment of a criminal or civil trial. Smith and attorneys for Stevenson discussed a settlement in the neighborhood of $10,000, but negotiations broke off when word came of Madge's deteriorating condition. Marion County Prosecutor Will Remy prepared a warrant for Stevenson's arrest on kidnapping and assault charges on April 2nd. At his arraignment 4 days later, Stevenson was asked by a reporter for a comment on the case. "I refuse to discuss such trivial matters," Stevenson replied. "How would you like to be fishing right now and watch a red darter spinning in front of a base?" Pressed further, Stevenson harumphed, "Nothing to it. I'll never be indicted." But attitudes in Indiana towards Stevenson were changing rapidly. Reports concerning the rape on the train appeared in newspapers throughout the state. Public indignation with Stevenson grew by the day, reaching a fever pitch by the time of Madge's funeral. On that day, Judge James Collins announced that he was rejecting a defense motion to quash the indictment. Stevenson would face trial, and now it would be a murder trial. In late April, the coroner's office released a report on the autopsy of Madge. Based on a chemical analysis of Madge's internal organs, the report concluded that her death was due to mercurial poisoning, self-administered. The report complicated the prosecution's efforts, as it could now be anticipated that the defense would contend that Stevenson's rape was not the proximate cause of her death, and that therefore he could not be convicted of murder. If infections resulting from the rape were not the cause of death, Prosecutor Remy might now have to prove that duress from the rape and kidnapping was so closely connected to Madge's decision to ingest the mercury tablets as to make it a foreseeable consequence of the rape, and that would be a difficult task. 8 days after Stevenson pleaded not guilty, defense attorney F. Inman filed a motion for a change of venue, which was granted. The Stevenson trial was headed for Noblesville, Indiana, and the courtroom of Judge Fred Hines. Also faces charges for the murder of Madge were Stevenson's companions on the notorious train trip, Earl Klink and Earl Gentry. The defense's first attack was aimed at Madge's dying declaration. In a hearing before Judge Hines, the defense sought to prove that Madge died of mercurial poisoning, not infection resulting from Stevenson's bites, and that she was not in a sound state of mind at the time she gave her dying declaration. Inman called doctors to the stand, each of which stated his opinion that the mercury tablets were the cause of death. Then he called attorney Asa Smith, who admitted that he, not Madge, wrote the dying declaration. Inman failed, however, to produce any evidence that Madge was not in full possession of her faculties at the time the declaration was prepared. Accepting defeat as inevitable, the defense withdrew its motion to exclude the declaration from the trial. Meanwhile, news accounts of Madge's rape and death caused public opinion to swing rapidly against the Klan. Sentiment against Stevenson swung even more dramatically, thanks in part to the efforts of Imperial Wizard Evans, who saw the trial as a way of ridding himself of his troublemaking Klan rival. The trial of D.C. Stevenson, Earl Klink, and Earl Gentry for the kidnapping and murder of Madge opened on October 12th before Judge Will Sparks. Sparks replaced Judge Hines after Hines accepted the defense's motion for a new judge. Only after a record 260 potential jurors were interviewed, and the judge's patience with the process finally exhausted, was a jury of 12 men finally seated. Opening arguments were presented on October 29th. Charles Cox, for the prosecution, told jurors that the state's star witness, from the grave, would be Madge, clean of soul, but with her bruised, mangled, poisoned, and ravished body, standing by her grave's edge, with the shadowy wings of the dark angel of death over her, will tell you the story of her entrapment, of her being drugged, kidnapped, assaulted, beaten, lacerated with beastly fangs, and finally, as the culmination of indignities and brutalities unheard of in a civilized community before, how she was forced by the loss of all that a good woman holds dear to take the deadly poison that contributed to her untimely death. A series of prosecution witnesses described events and Madge's condition in the days after Stevenson's assault. The state's first witness, Matilda, Madge's mother, testified that when her daughter was brought home, her breasts had open wounds all over. The boarder at the Madges, Eunice Shutlitz, testified next and identified defendant Earl Klink as the man who claimed to be Mr. Johnson from Kokomo, and that Madge had been hurt in an automobile accident. Dr. John Kingsbury, the doctor who examined and treated Madge, testified that she told him she expected and wanted to die. Kingsbury told jurors that a week or so later he came to the conclusion that Madge's condition was deteriorating and was hopeless. Kingsbury testified that the lack of prompt treatment in the first several hours after Madge took the poison most likely ended her chances of recovery. George, Madge's father, testified next and reported that Madge begged and begged her abductors to get her to a doctor, but they refused. Attorney Asa Smith, the family friend who prepared the dying declaration signed by Madge, presented the testimony that cleared the way for the introduction of Madge's account into evidence. Smith admitted that he wrote the declaration in his office, but testified that it was based on notes from his bedside conversation with the dying woman. The attorney said that he went over each line of the statement with Madge, making any corrections that she suggested. On cross-examination, defense attorney F. Inman raised questions about the declaration, probing Smith about why he didn't know the name of the notary public who acknowledged Madge's signature, and suggesting that the statement was really based more on Smith's imprecise memory than Madge's actual words. When Will Remy tried to enter the dying declaration into evidence, the defense objected on the ground that Madge's death resulted from her suicide, not the actions of any of the defendants. Judge Sparks, however, admitted the declaration and allowed Remy to read it to the jurors. The next phase of the state's case consisted of a series of witnesses who placed Madge on the train with the other defendants and then at the Hammond Hotel. A black porter on the train testified that he heard Madge say to Stevenson, "Oh dear, put the gun up. I am afraid of it." A night clerk at the hotel testified that he had checked Stevenson and Madge into room 416 under the name Mr. and Mrs. W. B. Morgan. A bellboy reported seeing bruises on Madge's cheeks. Finally, the prosecution presented evidence that the actions of Stevenson and the other defendants led directly to Madge's death. Beatrice Spratley, Madge's nurse, told jurors that a laceration on Madge's left breast became infected, and the infection was still visible at the time of her death. Dr. Virgil Moon, who performed the autopsy on Madge, testified that the immediate cause of death was an infection carried through the bloodstream, localizing in the lung and in the kidney. He expressed his opinion that but for the lacerations received during her assault, Madge would have recovered from her poisoning. Newspaper accounts trumpeted the medical testimony as a severe blow to the defense case. In its case, the defense strongly contested the prosecution's suggestion that Madge's death resulted from the mercury tablets she voluntarily ingested. Dr. Orville Smiley and Dr. J.D. Moskell, both Indianapolis doctors who had treated cases of mercury poisoning, testified that in their opinions the cause of death was bichloride of mercury, not an infection. Coroner Dr. Paul Robinson, disagreeing with the doctor who performed the autopsy, told jurors that the official verdict of his office on the cause of Madge's death was also mercury poisoning. After presenting yet another doctor to testify that mercury, not lacerations, killed Madge, the defense called to the stand a witness, Cora Householder, who the defense planned to use to undermine the prosecution's suggestion that Madge was as pure as the driven snow. Householder would, if permitted, testify that Madge had been having an affair with her estranged husband. Judge Sparks cut the defense questioning off, sustaining a prosecution objection to Householder's testimony as irrelevant and inadmissible. The defense had better luck with dentist Valerie Ailstock, who told jurors he once had Madge ask him for a glass of gin in the company of Stevenson. E.B. Schultz, the wife of a local Klan organizer, testified that Stevenson and Madge had visited her house in November 1923, 2 months before Madge said she first met Stevenson, and that Madge called Stevenson dear and Stevie. Ralph Rigdon, a close political friend of Stevenson, provided the most surprising testimony, placing Madge and D.C. together in a hotel suite enjoying gin weeks before the alleged assault. In cross-examination, defense attorneys labeled Rigdon's testimony a plain lie, and soon a shouting match between attorneys erupted that finally led to Judge Sparks cautioning, "Now, gentlemen, if you can't conduct yourself properly on both sides, I am going to get somebody that will." Following more testimony and more heated exchanges with Rigdon, the defense produced 2 more witnesses who also placed Madge and Stevenson together on occasions well before the ill-fated train trip to Hammond. In his 3-hour-long summation, Will Remy told the crowed courtroom that the defendants destroyed Madge's body, tried to destroy her soul, and over the course of the trial tried to befoul her character. He called the testimony of various defense witnesses, part of Stevenson's gang, who tried to tarnish Madge's reputation, nothing but a maze of lies and artifices. He told jurors they should convict the defendants of murder because their refusal to provide immediate care after Madge's poisoning hastened her death. For the defense, Ira Holmes argued that suicide is not a crime in Indiana, and therefore the defendants cannot be considered accessories. He questioned the accuracy of Madge's dying declaration, telling jurors that the words in the document originated in the mind of Asa Smith. As for the prosecution's claim of premeditation, Holmes argued that because Stevenson did not force her to take poison. Charles Cox, in the state's second summation, described Stevenson as a sadist and moral degenerate who should be killed by the law. Let free, he warned jurors, these perverts would commit other outrages. But, he told jurors, you won't let them do it. Closing next for the defense, Floyd Christian argued that Madge's death was a suicide for which his clients bore no criminal responsibility. If a man went home and committed suicide because his banker refused to lend him money, you wouldn't hang the banker. It would be a plain case of suicide, as this is. Suicide can't be homicide. F. Inman, summing up next, claimed, there is some mysterious power in this state that is back of the persecution of this men. He argued that Madge had several opportunities to escape her captors, such as when she was in the drugstore buying mercury tablets. He said that because of her own actions, failure to flee or seek help, failure to immediately tell Stevenson that she ingested mercury, she, rather than the defendants, bore responsibility for her own death. Inman said that the defendants had already suffered far too much and that the jurors have a duty to make sure no more harm comes to these men. Finally, wrapping up for the state, Ralph Kane concluded his emotional speech by asking whether there's a man in this community who would sign a verdict to acquit this hideous monster who preys on the virtuous young daughters of our state. On November 14, 1925, after 4 hours of deliberation, jurors filed into their courtroom to announce their verdicts. Stevenson was found guilty of second-degree murder. Clink and Gentry were acquitted. Stevenson, leaving the courtroom, told a reporter, "Hell, we've only begun to fight." His attorney, Floyd Christian, added, "Of course, we will appeal." 1 week later, having been sentenced to life, Stevenson heard the gates of Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, Indiana slam shut behind him. Stevenson counted on a pardon from his friend and political ally, Governor Ed Jackson. Political calculations for Jackson, however, were far different than they had been before the Madge assault. D.C. Stevenson was no longer a popular man in Indiana. No pardon came. In July 1927, in revenge for not getting his expected pardon, Stevenson released to the press little black boxes containing the names and incriminating records of political leaders in Indiana who had been on the Klan payroll. The information led to the indictment of Governor Jackson and other public officials. The resulting publicity also led to a crackdown on the Klan, and its influence in the state rapidly declined. The Stevenson appeal was not decided by the Indiana Supreme Court until 1932. With 3 justices dissenting, the Supreme Court affirmed the conviction. Stevenson was paroled in 1950, but arrested again just 8 months later and sentenced to another 10-year term. In 1956, Stevenson was discharged from prison a second time. In 1961, in Independence, Missouri, Stevenson was arrested on charges on attempting to sexually molest a 16-year-old girl. The man who once said he was the law in Indiana died on June 28, 1966, in Jonesboro, Tennessee.